martyr who was killed while battling Zionist forces trying to arrest him in 2017, left us with his concept and example of al-muthaqqaf al-mushtabik. Muthaqqaf means intellectual here, and mushtabik comes from the root word shabak, from which we get our words for clash and battle, but also for net, as in networked, connected, engaged. We're here to talk about boycott and refusal, and what engagements refusal can open up. As a project that got started in 2008 by taking international writers to occupied Palestine, moving around the land with them as much as we could, seeking connection and collaboration with Palestinian writers, teachers, and institutions and collectives resisting Zionist occupation, PalFest has been practicing the boycott of Zionist cultural actors and institutions from its inception. We see boycotts and organized refusals as beginnings, not as endpoints. Last year, we worked with a coalition of other groups to organize around 7,000 international writers and bookworkers into a literary boycott of Israeli cultural institutions that are complicit in the genocide, occupation, and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. So that's festivals, prizes, publishers, and so on. There have been numerous and important boycott positions taken up across the arts, in music, in theater, in film, and many other places. And what this upswell of support for Palestine signals is that people are ready to respond, to take professional and personal risks that they maybe didn't think were possible, or maybe didn't see as being necessary before. It also signaled that a potentially critical mass of artists are ready to begin. Today, Israel continues the killing, the bombing, the burning of Palestinians and their land, the bombing of South Lebanon with American weapons and under American political and cultural enablement and cover. So, we practice and understand our refusal as both necessary and insufficient, like every other form of protest. We want to go further, to think more and more deeply about what can come from these refusals, what more can come from these refusals. We've invited 6 writers and literary workers to reflect on the constraints and complications of literary boycott under capitalism and how to work through those constraints, on the links between refusal and action, on the production of language in relation to the current catastrophe in Palestine. With their contributions, we hope to propel a discussion that helps us all generate more action, more engagement, more organizing. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our first 2 readers. So we're going to start by hearing from Ismail Ibrahim, who is a writer whose work has appeared in Bidun, N+1, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, Protean, and Triple Canopy. And then after Ismail, we will be hearing from Benjamin Krusling, who's a writer and artist completing a PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of the poetry collection Glaring, Fear of God Essentials is forthcoming from Nightboat in 2027. Recent critical writing from Benjamin has appeared in the Paris Review and the Journal of Palestine Studies. So please give a very warm welcome to Ismail. Thanks.
Thank you. A prisoner who refuses to speak under interrogation does not end the occupation, nor the extermination of her people, but she does not contribute to them either. This is not nothing, though she has done nothing. It is very difficult to do nothing. There are collective forms of refusal that can stop the killing machine: a strike, a sit-in, an organized boycott. I am not going to talk about these things. I'm talking about the small rejections which one must insist on if they wish to retain their humanity. Though I attended many street marches and wrote and organized, though I quit my job at a media institution I felt was complicit, donated money and all the rest, I know I did not stop a single bomb from falling on Gaza. It fills me with shame to say that, but I know that it's the truth. I did not stop a single child from dying, a single home from being destroyed, a single person from starving. Still, I refused to vote for the party that armed the genocide, refused to publish in outlets that manufactured consent for it, refused to make an equivalence between Palestinian resistance and their annihilation, refused to capitulate to the framing that history began on October 7th, and refused to buy products that materially contributed to Palestine's destruction. Though I know I did not stop the genocide, I know that I did not accelerate it either. That is not nothing. There is another dimension to this. Call it the psychological or the spiritual, whichever you prefer. Each refusal was a fortification of the self against the forces of destruction. I do not believe that I am incapable of evil, that I cannot become the person dropping a bomb on a refugee camp or shooting a child in an aid line. People lose their clarity slowly, over time. A compromise here or there until you've convinced yourself that it's not so bad to work at a company that builds weapons. And then, if that is not so bad, then using them cannot be so bad either. There's not a clear signpost to tell you that you finally crossed over the line that separates good from evil, though the world is filled with incentives to get you there. You might need to put a roof over your head or want to have dinner with a relative and not get in a fight with them. Is biting your tongue or providing for your family really all that bad? Or your country may have a mandatory conscription, and you may ask if taking a simple administrative role, filling out forms, signing pay stubs and the like, is really killing anyone. What I'm trying to say is something unfashionable, which is that there is a soul, and that one can lose it when they do something they know to be evil, no matter how small that evil is. During the last 2 years, I quoted Wendell Berry often. He wrote, quote, "Protest that endures is moved by a hope far more modest than that of public success, namely, the hope of preserving the qualities in one's heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence." The hope of preserving the qualities in one's heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence. Refusal cannot stop the forces of destruction. Its only goal is the preservation of your heart and spirit. That is not nothing. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for having me, and apologies in advance if I don't say enough about what I'll talk about, but there's too much to say. I want to say something about aesthetics or style as it relates to the problems of form, production, value, and circulation that this panel has been convened to discuss. In our common sense, we can separate the literary broadly as a mode of writing from other kinds of writing, partly by acknowledging its vague inutility. A poem or novel does not produce knowledge in a rational way through reasoned argumentation or the analysis of data. But to start here is to accede in advance to a separation of labor that, as Lukács says, destroys the image of the whole. We still read Fanon, Césaire, Jordan, Marx, Kanafani, etc., because of what they said and how they said it. The question of style or the poetic or the affected, even the difficult, whatever you like, is not necessarily narrow or secondary or bourgeois, but key to any discussion about how writing works and how we work on writing. Everyone living in the United States for too long risks becoming stupid without a supreme effort to refuse it. This is another way that separation, hierarchy, and domination are manifested. If politics and aesthetics are entwined as the modes of power and concept that make experience possible to think at all, we don't have to exceptionalize the US to understand that propaganda here is deep, extensive, and embedded in many of our categories of discourse, liberal, democracy, terror, etc., and subtended by the extractive relationship. I didn't finish that sentence, but you know we have one. This is why Joy James, after citing C.L.R. James on historians, quote, "They write so well because they see so little," adds, in her own words, "Resisting violence is a mandate, If our writing suffers because we see more than we can articulate, that's fine, at least we tried. To say something meaningful about the pervasiveness and urgency of genocide is here linked immediately to a question of style, of writing well, of risking the fraying of something, sometimes called propagandistically craft. The social arrangements which produce and separate us have at their root this creation of parts that destroy thinking, and they permit forms of psychic obscurity and ego preservation that can result in writers and artists wanting to be somehow radical in language while preserving and apologizing for the relations of genocide, like the group of, quote, experimental writers who attempted to force the project to rescind their endorsement of PACB after October 7th. Their experiments in writing depend on the preservation of a kind of bourgeois indifference to genocide against which they engage in a zone of mildly interested play of signs. So I talk about style to help center our consciousness on the how of the task, but our method has everything to do with what we allow ourselves to think and what we prepare ourselves to do. To think and act on reality or what exists from the perspective of the people most immiserated by it is to begin to end this division of labor, this separation into parts that produces good writing, writing well, and the ability to see this writing as anything other than a total expression of one's life in society. Of course, the kind of writing I'm trying to value here is not often valued in general, i.e., it does not make much money even by the low standards of the publishing industry. Our situation, our world order, is saturated by genocide and totally yoked to it. Many know this directly. Others find it out when spectacular genocidal crises, like the last 2 years of US-Israeli annihilation in Gaza, force this knowledge into consciousness. Some deny it at the cost of their spiritual and intellectual coherence. And even then, many of the poets who populate the US poetry industry, small press or not, hit their heads against the same brick walls. See, for instance, 2017's edition of the Harvard Review, where over 200 poets wrote rengas, which is a Japanese form. For Barack, we tortured some folks, Obama, to commemorate him and protest the then new Trump administration. The point is, if you want a career in US poetry, if your dream is to sing from the balcony to the hoi polloi, you may one day find yourself being asked to sing the national anthem. You may even do it and blew the notes a bit to gesture towards something like critical thought. And still, as critical as institutions like the Project and small presses are to maintaining a sphere in which some things we want to do in writing and culture can become more possible against a general cultural neglect and assault, these places too have not been free from Zionists, sex pests, ghouls, racists, and work that refuses to think too hard about the world it takes place in. Poetry is not a luxury, sure, and aphorisms are not an excuse. The question of style then claims a kind of demand for integration from the alienated person who writes, since the how and what of activity exert total pressure on one another and are unthinkable apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you, Ben. So I'm now going to read a text by Abdeljawad Omar. Abdeljawad is a writer and a lecturer who's currently based in Ramallah, where he teaches at the Philosophy and Cultural Studies Department at Birzeit University. You can read his writing in English at Salvage, Mondeweiss, and other outlets. So I think it's always a little strange to read someone else's work, sometimes can be, but also this text is, I think it's a really important provocation, and I kind of wish he was with us tonight so that we could discuss some of it more spontaneously. It's called The Failure to Cross Over. Writing does not write, it exscribes. Leaks from a site that never consented to speak. One could say that writing begins already in failure. the failure to keep the promise that the word might accompany the deed, that the said could coincide with the done. Each sentence performs this impossibility. The performative trembles, the declarative exposes its own impotence. What if writing were not the cure, but the cough, a reflex, an expulsion, the body's protest against what it cannot metabolize in action? To write is to signal the infection of language, to become symptomatic of a grammar that refuses mastery. The I that writes arrives dispossessed, delayed, haunted by an address that precedes it and by a deed that never quite arrives. Here, for us in Palestine, such failure is not a theoretical abstraction. It enunciates our suspension, the paralysis between saying and doing, where each word testifies to the impossibility of its own realization. Words gather, organize, grieve, but they falter at the threshold of the deed, that impossible domain where the question, what is to be done, remains both imperative and unanswerable. Writing here becomes an archive of hesitation, a record of the unspeakable labor of aligning utterance with survival, and of the betrayal entailed in that very alignment. To act here is also to be unmade. To resist is to fracture the order of the world while knowing that the world will not bend to one's intention. Writing, then, stands as both witness and wound. The persistence of a voice that cannot heal, that will not cease, that remains faithful to its own undoing. Perhaps the symptom is not merely personal but territorial. Language itself occupied, scripted by forces that precede us, scripting us in return. To write from here is to bear the tension between testimony and betrayal, between saying and staying, between theorizing and acting. The page becomes both a shelter and a witness stand, its silence more eloquent than any resolution we could offer. But perhaps more than anything, writing is the symptom of the difficulty of crossing over, of moving from word to deed, from saying to doing, from surviving to inhabiting. It is the trace of that failed passage, the trembling remainder of what cannot yet arrive. Crossing over, when it occurs, expiates the need to write. Deeds speak their own syntax. They do not require self-commentary. They generate only brief after images, short passages adrift from the self-indulgence of explanation. Action is its own erasure. It refuses the archive. It burns the text that would seek to capture it. And so writing persists where crossing fails, a prosthesis for the deed that cannot sustain itself, a repetition of what could not be performed. It is not, therefore, surprising to see writers fail to cross over or to truly inhabit the truth of Palestine. Writing protects them from it. It installs a prophylactic distance where immediacy would demand risk. To write is to defer the reckoning, to remain safely within the interval of language, suspended, self-regarding, cowed by the possibility of action. The page becomes a shelter for the fearful, a space where one can perform proximity while remaining untouched. Yet the suspension is not without its own indictment. Each sentence testifies to the cowardice of articulation, the privilege of hesitation. Writing in this sense is not innocent. It is complicit with the very delay it names. Thank you to Abdeljawad. I wish he could be here with us. Miren, will you come introduce the rest of our readers? Thank you.
So our next three readers. Hannah Black is an artist and writer currently based in the south of France. Alessandra Bastagli is vice president and publisher at One Signal, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. She has worked in both indie and corporate publishing for over a quarter century, including in online news at Al Jazeera America. And our last reader is Nour Annan, a writer, artist, and organizer from South Lebanon. She lives and works in New York. Please join me in welcoming Hannah Black.
I'm hoping some other people are going to get really concrete and practical and properly political, but I'm not going to be the one to do that. I'm going to basically read you a prose poem. I'm sorry. There's a line I thought Katja Diefenbach wrote, but now I can't find it. These left officials of sad passions, aren't they ashamed to be always the ones standing there with too many words? But I must have misremembered it because it doesn't Google. Whether my words are too few or too many, I am equally ashamed. While ranking all the feelings in terms of their political utility, I wonder if shame's uselessness really outranks the uselessness of love. There is the sense of the genocide having collapsed language and resuscitated it on new and unfamiliar terms. A zombie language mortgaged to a narrowing horizon. I'm talking English, I'm talking about English. A kind of stagflation, a hollowing out, a torrent of suffering and images of suffering, the smug syntax of professional havers of opinions. For our part, precarious declarations of inevitable victory. I reconsider the ban on the sacred image, not mine to reconsider, not my silence, not silence, though increasingly the living have nothing to say to the dead. Why doubt the power of the written when the ruling class feels literally murdered by phrases, and Zionism began as literature, says Kanafani, before infesting the land with a zombie language, cowering in the face of the name of God. Hatred of perpetrators is more important than love of victims, but both. The universe is a machine powered by the forces of love and hate. Empedocles, Downtown, Freud. Right after October 7th, it seemed momentarily simple to move the world, as the world was already moving and everything was clear. It was only, or at least partly, a matter of denouncing the decades of encrusted silence. At the dawn of decolonization, Palestine was colonized. Iqbal Ahmed registering his astonishment and dismay at history's tendency to produce anachronism, kairos, chiron. Everything was pulverized and polarized by experimental war and the fascist imposition of universal psychosis. Modernism is a shroud. We had withdrawn from the world. Now we came back to it, stunned, if not surprised. Previously proud of our bylines, we ate the late ashes of our punctual achievements. We had once felt somewhat powerful. We thought the world lived by language. We continue to have entire PhDs and childhoods to unlearn, the desire to be known by a name. In 1943, Suzanne Césaire said that surrealism was hope's tightrope over the abyss of fascism, the inner space of rebellion that keeps alive the outer. The communists disparaged surrealist discipline, but only the latter had fully registered the existence of the colony and the so-called primitives' accurate assessment of the emptiness of art. I am no longer an intellectual. My favorite artist is Miss Rachel. Miss Rachel taught my daughter to sign the word for more, bringing her fingers together in supplication. She could already say the word, but she signed it too, with her two intact hands, when she really, really wanted it. More. I want more. This was not long before Miss Rachel became the only living American to believe in public that Palestinians are babies when they're born. Ms. Rachel was responsible for a global acceleration in children's language acquisition. I cannot begin to express all the ways this is not a coincidence. It was an act of love for her son who could not make the right shapes with his mouth. He had yet to force language through the narrow gate of the word. Not even God knows what coincidences mean, the tightrope of our hopes. Apart from these small exceptions, everyone you previously admired at a distance would be glad to spit on your grave, not only the writers, but the doctors and the therapists. All politics in English is cosplay if you say so. That's the impasse and the scandal. It's always the 1960s, and it never will be again. Writers are not laborers in the plain sense of it. We're more like mosquitoes or raccoons going through the psychic trash, but it's necessary to find ways to organize surplus life. Thank you.
Hi. I'm so glad Hannah said that about someone talking more in practical terms, because I'm not an artist or a writer, I'm just an editor. And so I hope you will tolerate my very pedestrian text here. But so as book editors, we actually have a number of avenues to ensure that our refusal has impact. And one is to speak up publicly. I signed this letter to signal to my junior colleagues and my BIPOC colleagues who might not feel safe signing such a letter, and to my authors that this is how I plan to run our imprint. I also signed it because, as Mariam Kaba's father once said, everything worthwhile is done with others. In short, I saw the impact of this action as being primarily on my peers, my staff, and my writers. Then, as book editors, we also have the avenue of the books we publish. And here too, where you are in your career can matter. To be clear, as an editor, you are unlikely to get censored outright. But you might be told by your superiors that a certain type of project or a specific category of author isn't commercially viable. The truth is, even as senior editors and publishers, you only have so much control over what projects you can buy or how much you can spend, both to acquire the book and to publish and promote it. While especially as junior pub workers, it might be hard to refuse to work on a book that has been assigned to you, as an acquiring editor, you can always proactively seek to acquire books that speak truth to power and challenge the status quo. The third avenue is the most complex, but is essential if we want our actions to have impact on the ground as well. Publishing staff should identify how and where our corporate owners are investing, as it could include weapons manufacturing companies, dubious media ventures, or businesses in Israel. And you guys should all go check out the website, because a lot of it's there. If it turns out that they are making these investments, we as employees need to demand that they stop. The good news is pub workers and writers can make that change at that corporate level as well, if we work in concert. Staff would have to raise our concerns internally and be prepared to walk out if we are not heard. At the same time, authors have to voice their concerns to their publishers and be prepared to pull their books. We saw this strategy work when Hachette acquired Woody Allen's memoir and when SNS wanted to distribute a book by the cop who murdered Breonna Taylor. As long as we live under capitalism, withholding the means of production is the only way to change our corporate overlords' business decisions. And I wanted to, again, because I'm not a writer, but something Ismail said about that Wendell Berry quote reminded me of something Ursula Le Guin said, which is, you cannot buy the revolution, you cannot make the revolution, you can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere. Thank you.
Okay, apologies, I don't have poetry, and I will be reading something a little more practical, let's say. I'm going to be reading a piece about by the Writers Against the War on Gaza about boycotting the New York Times, which you may have heard of. If you haven't, talk to me after. And a version of it was previously published in issue 20 of the New York War Crimes, which is here on this table. It's free. It's excellent, and none of the editors own stolen Palestinian homes, so you can feel better about reading it. In light of the most recent ceasefire agreement, it is all the more important for those of us in the imperial core to make sure institutions complicit in the genocide in Gaza cannot evade accountability for their actions. Most of us here know that the New York Times figures among those Western institutions now desperately trying to wash their hands off their crimes amid shifting public opinion on Palestine. Hussam Shabat, one of the far too many Palestinian journalists martyred by Israel for exposing its crimes, put it best. A reason we are still being bombed is because of the New York Times and most Western media, he said. The New York Times is complicit in this genocide. The so-called paper of record played a critical role in manufacturing consent for the genocide in real time, giving platform to the debunked myth of mass sexual violence on October 7th, sowing uncertainty around the IOF's targeting of hospitals, or using every trick in the book to avoid ascribing guilt for assassinations, to name a few tactics. And they will likely play a similar part in trying to rehabilitate the image of Israel now, like it did back in 1982. Israel's massacre of thousands of children and other civilians in the Shatila refugee camp and the surrounding Sabra region in Lebanon had threatened to break through the Zionist narrative stronghold on the West. Echoing what Palestinians had known for decades, that Zionism is Nazism, even Ronald Reagan, in a phone call with Menachem Begin, described the event as a Holocaust and demanded Israel end its campaign. Terrified to lose their grip on Western discursive hegemony after this defeat, Zionists established media watchdog groups like the Committee for Accuracy in the Middle East Reporting and Analysis, CAMERA, to paper over the truth of their crimes by pressuring journalists and executives for corrections and editorial standards that toe the Zionist line. The current executive editor of the New York Times, Joseph Kahn, learned to read and analyze the news with his father, Leo, who sat on the board of CAMERA. Leo was still on the board when his son was first hired at the Times. Today, Joe Kahn is the highest-ranking journalist in the paper's newsroom, continuing his father's legacy of propping up Zionist lies under the banner of journalism. This is but one of the many links that bind the New York Times to the Zionist entity, to apartheid, occupation, and genocide. Many of the Times' top-ranking editors, reporters, and executives have served in the Israeli occupation forces and have close family members who have. They have worked or still work directly for Israeli think tanks, or they live in stolen Palestinian homes. If you go online, you can see a dossier of every single one of these editors and their ties to the IOF, NewYorkWarCrimes.com. How can we hold such an institution accountable? Writers Against the War on Gaza launched our Boycott, Divest, Unsubscribe campaign in an effort to get writers and readers to break away from the Times. While this campaign has undoubtedly changed perceptions of the paper among some of the population, much more is needed. To that end, we have brought together a coalition of organizations in and out of the Palestine Solidarity Movement with the aim of severing the economic relationships that the Times depends on. That doesn't just mean subscribers or advertisers. We're also interested in organizing those who the Times pays and who, by writing for the paper, lend it legitimacy. In particular, our coalition has identified that the Times uses its opinion pages to launder its reputation, to create plausible deniability for its complicity in genocide. Many celebrated the paper for publishing an opinion piece finally calling Israel's annihilatory campaign a genocide after 2 years, while the news side of the operation kept denying it. It also uses the section to publish and benefit from the clout of young, especially Black and brown writers that it would never bring into the newsroom as full-time reporters. We are calling for writers, academics, artists, and anyone else asked to write for opinion pages of the Times to refuse, at least until some essential demands are met. Screams Without Words, the discredited article which bolstered the myth of mass sexual abuse, must be retracted. The editorial board must use its massive influence over liberal opinion to demand an arms embargo, the only true way to undercut Israel's increasingly belligerent assaults on Palestine and its neighbors. And finally, the Times must reckon with deep anti-Palestinian bias in its newsroom, updating its style guide, methods of sourcing and citation, and hiring practices. Over 200 contributors have joined us as well, and hopefully after tonight we'll have a few more. Each passing month, as the groundswell rises in solidarity with the Palestinian people, more and more are coming to recognize the Times narrative collusion with Israel and are joining our ongoing work to expose its revisionism, reveal its material ties to the Zionist entity, and ensure that there are consequences for its journalistic malpractice. Our boycott efforts dovetail with those on the ground. Actionists have blockaded its Long Island printing plant, hacked New York City subway ads in a détournement of its signature font, staged pickets outside Khan's West Village apartment, occupied its Manhattan headquarters, and doused its facade with red paint, as well as the message, NYT lies, Gaza dies. Israel continues to assassinate journalists in an attempt to hide its crimes from the world. But the silence that marks the absence of Hussam Shabat and the hundreds of other martyred journalists is palpable. We can feel its weight. Unlike these journalists who gave their lives to expose the truth, those who write for the Times have no claim to the title of journalist. To write for the Times is to give away one's commitment to accuracy. Our campaign is not just a takedown of the media. It's about exposing the gears of the current genocide and the Zionist project itself. The New York Times is the paper of record, and on the record we find decades of racist obfuscation and outright lies, a safeguard of Zionist violence. We must work to undermine their prestige and legitimacy so that the Times no longer has the power to change the story. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our readers. We'll take literally 2 minutes to set up the stage for the conversation, so don't smoke, stay here. We'll smoke after a lot. But yeah, we'll just stick around for the next 2 minutes as we do this. Okay, hello. Yes, do you wanna? I made it. Come by the cafe. Hi. Yes, please come by the cafe.
It's like a full Android phone.
I'm so glad you made it. Oh my gosh, me too.
Hello. Hi.
Okay, so you're gonna go 2, 1, 3. We're gonna get started.
And yeah, just remember, we're very much going to open up to conversation around the room. So, start thinking of some questions as we go along. But Maren, you want to start us off?
Okay. We had a plan, and we're like straying a little bit from the plan just to respond to what was said tonight. When we initially sort of planned this event with Yasmin, we were thinking about the various positions we occupy within the several sort of fields we produce and we live in, our both our work and our socialities, etc. We're writers, so we think through craft as writers, and we think through like style and genre, and we make all these decisions as we write. And we also think about writing as it exists within a larger system of circulation, consumption, and a system that's often sort of embedded with has various interests sort of vested in it. So like there's a system in which writing circulates. This is why we have publishers here tonight, and also we have writers, so people who sort of language workers, people who think through language. And I want to start perhaps by just even sort of, I was also interested in the way that each of you like premised a little bit their intervention by saying, I'm not going to offer something practical, I'm going to read poetry, or I'm not going to read poetry, I'm going to offer something practical. And so just that kind of dichotomy, which to us was interesting, is why we're bringing you together tonight. And I want to start with you, Ben. You just read this text, so it's not the text you previously sent us, but this version is great. And so, so you were saying something about how you were advocating for the inseparability between the how and the what, right? So the how, meaning how we publish, how we read, where the institutions that support writing, etc., and the what being the craft, the content, the style, and how you were advocating for a sort of totality, which I thought was really interesting. And then I don't want to pitch that against Abdeljawad because he's not here tonight and it's unfair to him, but I was interested in the way that he sort of introduced writing, or like just like his depiction, he's like skating depiction of the writer as the page as a refuge, right, for the fearful, and this inability to cross over from words to action. And I think we all feel this way also as well. So we feel like all these things at the same time, perhaps, while also aspiring for the kind of totality you were describing, Ben. And Hannah, also you mentioned shame and the kind of surplus. Like you said, I don't remember the end. The end of your piece was really beautiful. It said we're not. We're raccoons or insects, and we feed on the surplus of whatever is left over. And I thought that was like, that's such a powerful image. But basically, this is just like a way of summarizing or synthesizing a little bit what was said. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that separation. Also, how you position yourselves as well as because I think we all write. We all identify as writers, and I know, Alessandra, you're a publisher. Sorry. But, we all have like a practice that we care about. So maybe, I don't know if any of you want to address this separation or feelings about that separation, whether it's reconcilable or not.
I can start quickly. I guess certainly the separation exists, and it takes place in language, like writer, activist, whatever. But like, I guess I also want to kind of challenge the premise of that framing in the sense that it assumes that like one's whole identity is saturated by being a writer, which is like obviously not the case, and it's not the case for the people I mentioned. I certainly don't think it's the case for me. And so I think like the sort of, dismissal of that position is right, but in a narrow sense in which like all one ever does is right. And certainly some people see that as their vocation and they write and they contemplate. But this is exactly the difference, I think, between something like pure contemplation in which you just consider the thing and then try to deepen your thoughts about it, and something that's more sutured to thinking and doing and these things are kind of in a relationship with each other that isn't easily separable. So obviously that position, due to the way that our society is arranged, might be an aspirational one, depending on, what your development is, and perhaps you started in a place of contemplation, it led you to action or something, but that seems like maybe a politically useful thing to do, is to kind of refuse to be saturated by that. Like, we all have to work and eat and get money and so on. And so, like, I work as a writer, I teach writing and so on. But, that's not the whole of my life. And to think about it in that way is to also accept this kind of separation of activities.
I feel like, I guess there's like two questions. Like, one is like an institutional question, like, in the sense that like writing is mediated by institutions like the New York Times or the Poetry Project, and like how are those adequate or not adequate to the moment, which might be a more sort of like a question that might have more in common with other spheres of political question, and like some of the stuff you were showing that has a lot in common with other kinds of organizing and research and so on. Separately, I guess there's a question about like literature as such, or like art as such, or whatever. And I mean, me and Ben were talking about the Kanafani book on Zionist literature. And if you wanted to take a really like polemical or like, how to say it, provocative like take on that, I mean, he's essentially like Zionism appears in literature before it becomes a political project. And you could say like, okay, that's because there's no actual, it has no actuality in a sense, because it's kind of like a virtual and psychosis-y like political configuration. It like needs to be born in literature, so it's not that you could, but in another way, if you want, like, if you want it to be like super, you could say like, oh, could we not also kind of like prefigure some sort of, like in a sense, literature is very powerful. If you look at Zionist literature, that has actually had quite powerful effects in the world. And then, I mean, we're in a like all-sided situation where I feel like all these things are true at once or whatever. Because the other thing is like, like in the war crimes piece, where it's like, actually there's been an extreme valuation of language in this moment. It's quite different, I think, from peak woke era, where I think there was a reason to be cynical, and there was a lot of like liberal, performative kind of, whatever, with no material substrate, or there was some material substrate, but it wasn't that interesting or whatever. And now it's like, there's words that are illegal to say. It's literally like being like a poet under Stalinism or something. It's like suddenly it's very important what is and isn't said, and and then there's like something like, I mean, it's interesting that it's called Screams Without Words, actually. I was thinking, because it's like the idea that there's a lot of words, and it's like, and it's almost like there's an ideological idea that there's some sort of living immediacy that language can, you don't even need language for the, it's just like, so in a way, I feel like we're in a time where we could actually bring ourselves to think about a really important like political efficacy of language and writing, in fact.
Like, maybe if someone from the audience wants to like add to this or comment or opening it up. No? Oh, not yet. Okay. We're still warming up. Okay. Do you want to ask the second question? Okay. So this was the second question we had prepared. First question, actually, but now second. So we had this question about the relationship between, Ben, in your previous version, you mentioned clarity, like how the entire system is meant to sort of obfuscate our ability to think clearly and critically. And Ismail, also in your text, you do mention a relationship to clarity in relation to sort of our own sort of internal moral compass. How do we stay close to our humanity? How do we maintain or preserve that clarity? And we were thinking about, and this is maybe more a question about like, general question that I think a lot of us, those who are organizing perhaps more than others face, but the relationship between clarity and strategy. So Ismail, I'm just gonna quote you. You say in your text, I am talking about small rejections, which one must insist on if they wish to retain their humanity. You also mention more collective actions, but you don't really dwell on these collective actions. You really insist on these like small acts of refusal. And so I guess our question is between like the relationship between these small acts of refusal and the larger acts of refusal. These small acts of refusal sort of keep us closer to a clearer sense of self, right, and of our own sort of moral stances. But once we enter more collective actions, it's messier and it's muddier, and we have to negotiate a lot, and sometimes lose that that proximity, that sort of moral. Not always. I mean, the goal is to preserve that moral clarity always, but it's way sort of messier. So I guess our question was on that relationship between the preservation of that kind of moral clarity versus a more collective actions that are perhaps leaning more towards strategy and are sort of more complicated. And again, this is for our speakers, but also if anyone from the audience wants to jump in, feel free.
I can speak to this a little about the small acts of refusal. So we've been thinking about this a lot, and I think what has, like, something really drastically shifted in the past 2 years in this regard, and that, like, we are used to refusing things for many, many decades. We're quietly refusing things, opting out of appearing in certain papers or on certain screens, or not accepting awards, not accepting to speak somewhere, just because we feel that because of this moral clarity, like, we can't possibly be associated, or we can't in good conscience show up to this thing. And I feel like what has changed is that now, like, quietly withdrawing, like, just doesn't work anymore, because, like, they're giving you hell, you might as well give them hell back. Like, honestly, I feel like people who are quietly withdrawing, for example, out of being given awards that are, like, linked to, you know, weapons manufacturers, or, like, literally linked to Israeli, like, weapons, I feel like they're doing everyone a disservice in that, like, you might as well just do it at that point, because, like, they don't know why you're withdrawing. Whereas when there's, like, 15, 20, 200 people withdrawing, like, suddenly that actually, you have this, like, collective bargaining power. You can actually have leverage. You can try to use that for something. Whereas when you're just like, I'm not gonna make it, I'm sick, or, like, I'm not interested in participating, then, like, they're just gonna move on to the next person. So really, I think, like, refusal has taken on a different, like, there's no power in just, like, refusing and staying out of their way. They're just gonna take up more space. But really, it's, like, insisting, either you're gonna be in the room and give them a hard time, or you're gonna have to, like, collectively refuse something. Otherwise, they're just gonna push us to the margins, like, as usual, I think.
Thank you. Ismail, did you wanna add to this?
Yeah, I think what I was discussing is a kind of, like, I don't really care. Like, it's not important to me if SodaStream nets another 2%, right? It's easy for me to say, like, oh, I won't buy one. However, if I compromised in a way that materially benefited me, for example, if I worked at the New York Times, then you can't actually have the same kind of clarity, because it becomes a decision, like a question of keeping the lights on. And that difference is where your vision starts to become obscure, because something nearer to you is blocking it, which is your living circumstances. And I think that that's not necessarily in contradiction of what Nour is saying, that, like, it's important to join together with other refusers, as it were. But to do so, you have to already have stepped back, in a sense, and looked at the thing clearly, which I am not being right now. But hopefully that answers something.
I think this is an important point about the private refusal, actually. I think especially in relation to BDS, like, you could argue it's like, it's like actually better, it's objectively, not just you might as well do it if you're not going to publicly refuse, but that in a sense it's even, like, degrading to the cause to have these kind of private refusals. So they're like below the level of meaningless. They're even potentially damaging, and that comes up a lot. I mean, I don't know it's been a while since I've been, like, directly trying to get people onto, like, PACB, but I feel like the first year of the genocide I heard a lot of, like, but we're effectively doing it already secretly. And you're like, what, how do people think the world? It's kind of an interesting, like, configuration.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I guess this might sort of be naive, but I feel like you just need both, right? I mean, you need to do your own small refusals in your day-to-day, and then you have to also have clarity with the bigger things and organize and do the right thing at the higher level as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think one thing that drove me crazy was when some of these awards, literary awards, people withdrew or like were nominated and then said they were going to refuse. The next year, with this one specific organization I'm thinking of, what they did was they asked publishers only nominate authors who actually would want to come and pick it up. And it was really interesting to see, because obviously I put that towards my authors and I said, do you guys want to be nominated? And the ones who had like day jobs were like, no, I don't want to be nominated. And the ones who really needed the money were like, I actually just really need the money. And so we did nominate them. And and I thought that was really interesting, because it's a function, obviously, then of privilege in some ways, of like how public you can be about your refusal and what you can say no to, and also how manipulative these organizations are, that they end up putting it on you. So like, oh yeah, so you guys are going to turn us down. Well, then now you're going to have to, sort of preemptively promise that you're going to accept this and stand on stage, which I thought was just horrific. And no one talked about it. It was just like an internal thing. So. Which again goes to the point of like the importance of speaking up.
Which prize?
Sorry?
Which prize?
PEN. And I mean, again, like the director's gone since then, so maybe things will change, but that's how it was for like 2 years.
Very sort of similarly to this, and also picking up on what you said, Nour, but like specifically, in the last year, we heard that from people who like work in the industry and have been trying to organize from within it, that quite quickly at like book fairs, which is where like a lot of people look to buy translation rights for books. So like, Italian publishers will be there wanting to buy the translation in Italian from whatever other language. So at book fairs, Israeli publishers started telling agents and editors that they've had long relationships with in different parts of the West. They started saying, please, just before you pitch me a book, make sure your author is actually gonna like let me publish this. So it seems kind of incredible, I think, when you're on the outside, when you hear something like that, because it seems like there's some kind of impact that's actually working and being felt. And this was quite soon. I wanna say this was like early last year. But then it begs this question of like, okay, well, if all those, this was before this letter went public, but if all of this is happening, if there is all of this refusal, and it's kind of being felt and having an impact in this way, what is it that's keeping it from being visible? Is it a like some sort of like drag, like a time drag in the organizing? The organizing is not happening fast enough to give people a sense of like coming into a collective and taking a collective stance because they're too scared to speak out on their own. A lot of writers don't want to be public figures. Like I know now, like writers are, expected to do press tours and whatever, but a lot of them don't want to be. So sometimes it's not just fear, it's like a kind of lack of instinct to go public with their political stances or whatever. So is it that, or is it something else that's keeping it from visibilizing more? And if it is an organizing question, that this takes us to the next question actually that we had prepared, which was kind of like some thinking really about what we can be doing, both trying to organize within institutions, including of course publishing houses, but also to be pressuring from the outside, which is very much, I feel like WAWOG straddles both of those with the New York Times campaign. So yeah, just a really kind of open question, maybe provoked by some of what we've heard tonight about, about what more we can be doing realistically or not so realistically.
But is your question more about how come some authors haven't been more visible about this, or is it more like, I'm just trying to understand, which part do you feel is slow? Is it that enough writers signing on to these things, or publishers dropping Israeli books?
It's the visibility of that, and the fact that even now I'm saying this like a year after I heard this information, and I find it hard to believe. Like I find it hard to believe that this was being felt by Israeli publishers, and And that kind of takes away from its collective power. Like if we think about it, we're in a battle of some kind in the cultural sphere that we hope has a material impact in stopping material and political support for the genocide and the occupation, then there's a loss of opportunity.
Yeah.
There's a loss of political impact there. That's my question.
I think we have to bring back cancel culture more intensely. I think it worked very well. I think that's what the New York Times boycott campaign and the whole New York Times campaign has done quite successfully. I think it's now a bit embarrassing to have done something for the New York Times, and hopefully that can be expanded outwards. And I think what was as much as I think cancel culture really achieved a lot. It really went into people's hearts. People were terrified of being cancelled in a way that was kind of amazing. It was almost had some, obviously it's less impressive than an actual armed guerrilla campaign, but it had some of the proportionality of it, where it's just what do you think I'm gonna do to you? It's oh my God, I'm not racist. That is really powerful tool, and I think that's where these the boycott and so on. It's not just having 50 people boycotting 100, whatever the numbers are, and obviously it would be great, especially the retraction of screams without words is a really important demand, but also to just generally terrorize people and make them feel that it's not acceptable to write for a Zionist publication is great, and a massive cultural shift.
That's what I'm always telling people, we need to bully more. I don't believe in peaceful, you need to actually bully people, and it does work, because it does, but I feel we always say when it comes to these campaigns, whether they're actively boycott campaigns or not, it's not just about appearing to people's moral sensibilities. The people who agree with us, they know our cause is righteous, they're going to be with us. So it's we're not going up to our enemies and being don't you look what's happening. They know what's happening. But I feel within a broader market, because this is about commodities at the end of the day, it's about publishing. It's about making the cost for them not participating higher than the cost of them participating. So it's them being worried that if they don't boycott Israel, they're going to suffer. Their books will not sell as well. They're going to get canceled. Then it'll be about that. We're not trying to tell them show us you're a good person, but it's more will the publisher be terrified of publishing a book that's pro-Israel because their people are going to attack them, or their stocks are going to suffer, or their sales are going to suffer? I think that's really what we need to be focusing on, instead of trying to convince people.
I also think in agreement with the point about bullying more, it's a lot of the people that work at the Times don't work there because I think they like the newspaper. It's because they like telling people that they work at the New York Times. They traffic in a kind of cultural capital that if you bully them, and if it becomes, as Hannah said, embarrassing to work for them or to do, then you just negate their whole reason for being there. It's it's no longer you can tell your uncle at Thanksgiving, oh, I work at the New York Times, and he'll be impressed. He'll be you're a piece of shit. And
you work for the State Department.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think isn't just what you said about keeping the lights on. I think that is actually the only counteracting thing, because it's obviously everyone has their limit to where they would no longer try and keep the light. If it was will you publicly murder kittens? It's you're not going to do. So I feel it's just changing the point system on that is kind of one of the few tools, and it's actually been amazing to see it happen in real time on the question of Palestine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in the question of cancel culture, and it's waxing and waning, because I do think that the genocide kind of deflated some of the general power of cancel culture, in the sense that it was sutured to a kind of institutional liberal power for a while. In the Times or New Yorker, you might get a damning profile, but now I think that there is this kind of larger way that a lot of institutions, especially in the new Trump term, have kind of like universities, et cetera, have given in to these demands in a certain way that has also kind of deflated some kinds of institutional ways that cancel culture interface with something larger. Mm-hmm. So I think what is great is we can still practice that within spheres that we have some control over, in poetry, which is the thing that I participate in. We don't sell anything, so I can't talk about that. But there are presses and so on after October 7th that, they had these weird founders who would post crazy genocidal shit on the internet, and they are canceled. It would be embarrassing to publish with them. It is embarrassing to publish in certain places. And I think the question of small refusals too, and why the war crimes has been so great is like producing these crises of legitimacy and like forcing that into consciousness that, you know, I think it's not just like I work at the New York Times and that's why people do it, but I think a lot of those people really believe in a kind of like journalistic objectivity to some extent, like they believe that's a real thing and their career aspired to practice it, which obviously, you know, like Alex Colston wrote a piece for The Nation today. He was on the flotilla and got out of prison last week about, you know, people were criticizing him. How can you be an objective journalist and you're also participating in a direct action? Like, it's just exposing the real thing, which is that all journalists are partisans, but I think this question of like making it clear to them that they are partisans in a certain way, like just as a certain kind of forced consciousness raising, and then the shaming seems, yeah, like it's actually been quite effective, at least in a lot of writing spheres. So,
I mean, just one quick rejoinder there is that, you know, and this comes up in book publishing as well as sort of news publishing, which is that, you know, neutrality in a time of genocide and fascism is untenable. Like, you know, that's all good and well to say you want to be an objective journalist, but not now. Like, you can't.
Yeah. Okay, Habiba has a question. You have a question, right? Oh.
Talk. I just wanted to talk. I don't know if I had anything to ask. Am I supposed to ask? No, I just wanted to talk. I was just like inspired by, I don't know, like for the last couple of days, like there's this Said quote, and I keep coming back to it, and it's like, he's like, Palestine is a thankless cause, which if you truly serve, you get nothing back but abuse and ostracism. How many friends avoid the subject? How many colleagues want none of Palestine's controversy? And I think this is, you know, this reigns supreme, and we need to be very clear about this, and there's no middle ground, and you know, your friends are your friends, and you're not friends or you're not friends. And I think in recognizing that, I don't know if the question of this action is important, this action is less important. I think all, like, as you know, as much as anyone can do, let's do. If it's talking to your uncle, if it's making the poetry, if it's like within these. I mean, I do see a need, obviously, for larger mass organizing that hits at capital. Of course, it's where the money is. Like, I get this, but also, like, I think it does in some way all count, and I think that, I don't know, people, I don't know, like, I come from a place where, like, fascism is, like, not, like, a question. It's just, like, a lived reality, and it's a very boring fucking reality. Like, they do it, like, they just annoy you. Like, they really get at you, they make your life difficult in small ways. Like, they don't want the flack of, like, coming at you with the AK. Like, they don't want that. They want to really make your life difficult in subtle ways that make you have to make these choices more, you know, in that. And I think we do need to recognize that some of it is like anonymous and not glamorous, and all of it I think is important, because there is a cultural shift, and people do recognize that if there's a group of people over there and they're really, it's like, you know, they're really doing something and people can see that, it does have an effect. You become a mass, you become a mobilized force. If you're hitting this middle ground of trying to convince someone who's like, who cares about aesthetics? Like, these liberals, they care about aesthetics. Like, that's what they, you know, like, then hit it there. Like, that's when they're gonna be like, oh, sorry, I meant no. and yeah, like, I don't know, this is just my.
Thank you, Habiba. Anyone else, Adam? I'm looking at you.
You have to ask a question. Okay. So there's a text by Hassan Mrouwe that Nour translated recently from Arabic to. It's here. NewYorkWarCrimes.com. Which is in Arabic, it's الحزن القاتل والحزن المقاتل, killer grief, fighter grief. And obviously it's a text. He wrote a text, but he was also a communist militant organizer. And you know, like, there's different kind of like takes on what's the role of the writer across the board. And I think each one of you approaches language and writing in a very different way. And I'm wondering, because I'm kind of like hung up on Abdeljawad Omar's text, because it's such a beautiful text. It's really well written, but it kind of like says that writing is trash. And I'm wondering more about kind of like a militant tradition where writing is kind of like conjoined with struggle, and it's not kind of like positioned in the margin of some kind of like a bourgeois contemplative project, but something that is also part of a kind of like an expansive practice. And I think you've kind of touched on that, Benji. And I'm wondering, you know, because some people also articulate shame in different ways. How do you kind of like think about your writing? Obviously not every piece of writing that you do in relation to kind of like a broader struggle. And is it kind of like writing in proximity to organizing, in proximity to struggling, or kind of like something that is complementary or reflective? Because I think there is kind of, you know, like we do have various traditions of intellectual thought and political analysis and writing and poetry that are very tethered and not separate from militant and political and leftist action. And they're not necessarily isolated.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think what has been amazing to me is that moments like 2020 summer, like everything that's happened here since October 7th, there is a way that when a movement or moment acquires this sort of broad consciousness and mobilization, that it does help produce knowledge very quickly. And that's like a conscious choice that people make. And I think me, for example, like I'd written about this and that before, and I'd signed things in support of Palestine during previous atrocities, and but I hadn't written anything as part of my like role as a writer until after October 7th, and that became something that I actively began to do as part of like thinking with people I was organizing with, and just feeling like this was the most critical thing to be sort of producing knowledge and language about. And so I think the kind of way that these moments like center consciousness and organize all of our activities on a number of fronts are, and I think Hannah's piece a long time ago about the Whitney Biennial says this really well, that like there are certain moments when it becomes really possible to do something, and I think we do have to seize those moments. And so I think, you know, we all have to deal with the kind of bourgeois separation of all these categories of occupation and so on that destroy the image of the whole, but there are moments where it's possible to overcome them in a really broad way, I think. So obviously there's the ongoing thing, and then there's these moments of crises that I think can really help close that.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually what you said about like the degree to which cancel culture has to be sort of like backstopped by liberal institutions, which I think is like complicated. Like you could say that the liberal institutions kind of responded to what was actually a pretty like grassroots, a grassroots popular kind of movement or whatever. I think like woke was actually very popular in an organic way, kind of, but like but at the same time, like the difference between the because I had like two like Whitney Biennial controversies like back to back, which I regret, but and we'll have to live with. but the gap between the two, I think, speaks to the kind of complexities of trying to leverage a certain kind of cancel culture, and also the difference of doing that in the name of Palestine versus Black America or whatever, which is that I think I didn't realize until 2009. So there was the controversy, initial, like the 2017 Whitney Biennial controversy, which was around sort of like images of suffering. And I'm still trying to think through all the ways that there's been, I mean, we talked about this recently, there's been shifts in terms of the sort of like ethical positions that we're dealing with at the moment. The relation to the image is really different. But I remember even at the time noticing that like, you know, it was like there was a discussion around like lynching images, which has a really specific kind of lineage in terms of anti-blackness. But then I would like go on Twitter, and this was like, I'd be like, I followed a bunch of accounts in Syria, and they just post like crazy, like very intense shit, like kind of prefiguring the sort of images that are coming out of Gaza recently. And it was like a completely different relation to like the horror image, and the political meaning of it was very different and so on. So I think what happened in 2017 was that in a sense the claim on which I meant in my intervention was meant in a certain kind of way, because it was like very like, I'm a Marxist and like whatever, but like I'm a communist and I think this is about the commodity and blah, 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 and it's about commodification. And it got kind of received as a question of a property question, an intellectual property rights question. So the whole thing of cultural appropriation was kind of basically like, who's intellectual property, or who has the proprietary rights over certain modes of expression, kind of, which was really confusing to me at first because I didn't understand that was what was happening. So then it was like very well received by a certain sort of like liberal bourgeois like black art world, because it was actually, and I think appropriately, because those are people who had been kind of frozen out of certain kinds of systems of valorization, like, which shouldn't have happened. So it was like, oh, this has actually like expanded the participation of like black artists and therefore the sort of share of the pie or whatever. Whereas in 2019, a lot of those people, I then like, you know, those people were not on side because it was more, because it was, you know, it was like a specific material campaign and it came out of the like museum staff, and it was like, it had in some ways more of the attributes of like classical political organizing. It was to do with like, yeah, and it included the question of the colonial and or the imperial or whatever. It was like, because it was to do with like the southern border and Palestine and like all these other sites where like tear gas is used and these kind of like supposedly non-lethal like weapons are being used or whatever. And like similarly, I think, yeah, so I think it's complicated. Like obviously like bullying, I think it is probably one of the few like effective tools, and it's real, but I think you're right, probably we have to like be realistic about like there's a different articulation of it, because it can't be fused to a kind of essentially like a mechanism of valorization kind of, because it's like the colony, which is the mechanism of value. So it's like you can't fuck with the mechanism of value, which is colonization. Sorry, that was a bit incoherent, but you know what I mean? I feel like you're nodding, so yeah.
To your point, Adam, about the writer and the role of the writer, and where's the writer who's mushtabik or like, you know, engaged and fighting, is I think also what's been revealed is that it's like so rare that someone is just a writer to be able to be like, oh, I'm just a writer, like I can't sign any statements. Like most writers in this day and age, they're also workers. They work at a publication. They work at a newspaper. They work in a community space. They are employees, and like that means something. Their labor relation means something. If they are like published authors who are not full-time employed somewhere, they have contracts. They have publishers. They have like, everyone is in a way, when we suddenly started investigating these things, you look and you're like, oh, I thought that I'm like a good person and I'm just a writer. Mm-hmm. And you find, oh, I'm entangled in this web of like really like the weapons manufacturers and like Israeli funding. And it turns out that 5 people on the board of the institution I work at, where everyone is so nice to me, are like actually like served in the IOF. Like, I think if someone is like really just a writer, I mean, congratulations to them. Like, I don't know who's your dad, but just like, it's like really, I think, so it's either at that point when all this information is revealed and everyone's trying to hold institutions accountable and hold each other accountable, it's either then that you're actively ignoring what relationships in your labor production are entrenched in genocide, or you're doing something about it, whether that's like talking to your coworkers or getting your institution signed on to PACB, or whether that's joining a mass movement. But you're doing something, or you're actively ignoring it. I think those are the options for writers. Like, I would say most writers.
But also, like, all writing is political, right? Because all storytelling contributes to the culture. The culture determines, you know, who society and politics. So I remember Toni Morrison saying this, right? That she had sort of withdrawn from I mean, she was very old at the time, and this was during the Black Lives Matter protests, and a young black man reached out to her and said, like, where are you? You know, and she's like, but I'm just a novelist. Like, I just, you know, and he said, no, we need you now more than ever. And she realized, yeah, actually, what I do is political, and I have to speak up right now. So I think that no matter what kind of writer you are, if you are an author as well and somehow being published, it automatically becomes political, whether it's poetry, fiction, nonfiction, because you are contributing to the culture. So it's inherently political, to my mind.
I think the question of where you are specifically asking about the relationship of writing and militancy is really interesting, because the piece you read, like, captured my worst fears, which is like, I'm writing because I'm a coward. Like, I'm not taking up a gun, if we're being honest about it. But I console myself by thinking that like my work with the war crimes, because I'm also involved, has been to open up a permissiveness towards militancy. I think that the work that the war crimes has done is to contextualize armed struggle, make it a position that's acceptable to hold, and decimate that wildly, like a virus. And this is in the imperial core, right? I can't think of any writers that I know. I mean, Beckett, right? Beckett fought in the resistance when France was occupied, but this is completely separate from his writing. You're not, you know, people will read Waiting for Godot and say, oh, it's about resist. It's not. It's completely different. So within the core, your activities outside of writing can resist. Within writing can create a structure of permissiveness for resistance, but mostly it's just cowardice because you're not being militant. You're holding a pen. Yet, you know, it's not for nothing that journalists in Palestine are targeted. It's not for nothing that, you know, in Plato's fascist republic, he wants to kill the poets. There is a power there. What that power is mysterious. I don't think that you can set out and say, you know, I'm going to write the novel that will, you know, get everybody to strap C4 to their chests and run into Exxon headquarters and blow it up. You can't set out to do that because you won't. And you have to be, back to clarity, you have to be clear about that. Otherwise, you're kidding yourself. You have a delusion of grandeur.
No, because we want.
I just want to also allude to something that Aboud is inviting us to think. It's not the binary whether we're courageous or cowardic in our writing, because I think it's the space actually between the deed itself and the writing. And what we do with this failure. I mean, most of the things that have been written about Gaza and about Palestine, they tend actually to obscure the deed, especially the militancy and the fighting and the armed resistance in Gaza. And I think this is what we should take. And maybe also be humble as writers if we know that this is our limit in writing the text, because most of the times also there's this performance, celebration of awards, and it's happening. I mean, the market and the industry, everything is happening at the expense of what's happening in Gaza. So just to see this space as an invitation to link between the actions and to think Gaza all the time in our being, like how we move in this world. So I don't think it's just like an easy way to say, should we write or we shouldn't write? I think it's more to center the deed that actually provoked all of this movement and what's happening. Yeah,
I agree, and I feel like also the sort of dichotomy between I'm gonna do armed revolution or I'm gonna write is like not a real binary. Like it's a social movement, it has to be social. Like you can't make that decision on your own. And so you need a situation in which it would be possible to do it. And so I don't think that one is a coward for choosing to like just die in a lone wolf activity for no reason. You know, like you do need like a movement of people to do it, and the project of doing these things has to be collective and social. So I just kind of reject like everyone's problem is this, that they're a coward. You know, like there are real like historical and political limits to what it's possible for any one person to do. You know, you're not going to solve them by yourself. So I'm not sure it's like helpful thinking, although one should always, you know, do some self-critique about where you're stopping yourself from doing more.
Yeah, there is one question. Okay, we're going to take two. I saw three hands at the same time suddenly. Okay, so Sunil, Jasmine, May. Okay, and then I think we have to wrap it up.
Yeah, I had a question about delegitimation, and I'm reminded of a moment by the Palestinian scholar Ibrahim Abu Gulakud, who butchered his name, I'm sorry, but he said something like, the New York Times doesn't recognize Palestine, fine, we don't recognize the New York Times. And I'm wondering about this question about delegitimation in relationship to like cultural institutions, whether it's museums, whatever else, these places that have a sort of, perhaps during the 2020 uprisings, there was some budging around sort of identity, inclusion, et cetera, that then kind of produced a sort of sense of accountability, right? That for certain institutions then might have, like we might think we can further pressure them on Palestine, whatever that might be, dropping board members or sort of complicity, right? But I think it's obviously antithetical to their functioning like so many other institutions. So I'm wondering how you all think about navigating this fundamental antithetical relationship to these bigger cultural institutions, and like how we might respond in that regard. Do you how do we understand this kind of like question of pushing? Like for instance, the Whitney, Warren Kanders gets down, but he's still the CEO of Safariland, right? And then someone takes his place that's just as implicated. So I'm curious about this in relationship to institutions where there's a sort of false sense of accountability that they might want to rehabilitate at some point, like even like Art Forum with the boycott of Art Forum, which had like really obviously tangible results. I don't know how many people still read Art Forum, but they're still trying to rehabilitate with the new editor, right? They wanted to have a whole Palestine issue. And so it's kind of like, and there's Palestinian artists who contributed to that. So I'm thinking about like, what is this, how do you see this notion of delegitimation moving beyond the institution and like moving away from institutions altogether? And like, yeah, thoughts about that.
Thank you. I would say, like, just to answer, of course, I think we all share your frustrations about, not being able to hold institutions accountable. But like, just in a very pragmatic sense, like, holding institutions accountable takes a lot of sustained organizing from people. Especially because everything is happening at such a rapid pace that like it's hard to keep up. And if we just like all collectively agree that we hate a place and then move on, it doesn't mean that that place is going to change anything, take what we say into consideration, become delegitimized. Like, it might just cause like a public scandal and then everyone forgets. Honestly, even now, like 2 years into this, I always like feel, I like would hear about like a certain institution in New York and I would be like, God, I hate those people. And I can barely remember like what happened. Because there's so many of like, we have no shortage of like evil institutions here that we have to fight against, but like we do actually have to like be very strategic. I think delegitimization is a good strategy, but it has to like be sustained. And it's not just about like trying to change these institutions because we believe that they can do better, but it's about like demanding change because like they need us. Like they need us. Like if we are the people who go to museums and we're people who go to events and we're people who read these books, like we have to believe that we actually have power to demand certain things of them. Because if we just like ignore them, it's not like they're going to be like, heartbroken over like the fact that we're like ignoring a particular like exhibition. Like that doesn't really cause any, like it doesn't put any pressure on them. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of institutions that are now trying to rehabilitate things, and I think some of them will get away with it just because there's no active campaign. Like the New York Times campaign was chosen strategically because it's the paper of record and because they are like manipulating truth and because they are like, just like repeating what the US State Department is saying. So like it was like chosen strategically for a lot of reasons, but also the fact that after 2 years in, people are now talking, like people who aren't involved in organizing, talking about like it being delegitimized or like, it publishes lies. Like this was an effort and like a product of a lot of organizing. And I wish we could do that for every institution, organization to get what we want, but maybe we're not there yet, but we'll work on it.
We're going to take
Hi. I really wanted to thank Nour and Hannah for mentioning like the productivity of bullying, because like I really love bullying, but
I didn't call it bullying
oh, sorry,
which is bad and shouldn't.
Okay, canceling.
I just said
sorry.
canceling.
Okay, cancel culture. I really like cancel culture, but sometimes I can't tell like when I'm doing it right or something, and so like I wanted to ask this question because like I've been saying the same thing for so long, but I really can't tell if it's helpful. And so like something I keep mentioning is I really, really dislike the idea of refusal or sacrifice as like the noble provenance of the privileged. I don't like the idea that the more you have, the more you are willing to sacrifice. Like it's kind of the inverse of what it's suggesting is like you're kind of obfuscating or erasing poor people or people with very, very little who have like historically been willing to sacrifice the most. And so, like I was thinking about, I also like signed the New York Times letter and have committed to not writing for them, but they were one of my first publications, like one of my first bylines, and sorry, I'm not emotional, I'm just really nervous. But they were one of my first bylines. It pays so well, it's $2 a word. They have such a big budget and like such power that they're willing to take so many chances. Like people who haven't published before can publish there because they're gonna get so many views from like whatever Joseph Kahn is writing that they were like, yeah, go to the Cosby trial and write about it, or yeah, write about this weird thing in your neighborhood. And so when I like refused to do that, it was money that I really missed, but I was so willing to do it. And like one of our trans friends, like our collective friend or shared friend who signed the letter was like, I'm not writing for the Times, and like in place of that money, I'm gonna start a GoFundMe. And so it's like, it's almost like we're in such rarefied air that it like warps scale sometimes. Like these aren't small things, but like historically, or like I don't like the idea that, you know, like an editor who's like not Black or not of color has to go first. So then like the Black people and the people of color are enabled to do that. Like historically, they're very willing to do it. And also like, nobody needs a fucking PEN award. Like you can't need a PEN award. I just don't believe that. And so, I don't know, am I making sense? Like, I wonder if that's an idea that's worth like trying to cancel, or if it's just like stoking infighting because like it's so bothersome and it's so like indicative of a kind of like, it's very rare to be a writer or have a PhD in this country. And so, yeah, sorry, if that makes sense. I'm asking if it's worthwhile or if I'm just mean.
No, I think that's totally on point. And I think that, I guess the PEN Award, I didn't set out to talk about the PEN Award, but now that we are talking about it, I mean, I think in the case of my writer, I did feel like it should be their choice. Like I shouldn't say, guys, this is terrible, none of you should apply, or not even give them the option. And just say, you know, we either are or not nominating you for PEN Awards, and I'm not even gonna consult you on it. So I felt like I had to, and when I did that, I also told them exactly what was wrong with PEN. Like, here's all the articles you need to read. Because a lot of people who aren't in New York aren't even thinking about PEN, you know? And specifically this writer of mine who is, you know, a struggling freelance journalist, is currently took a job teaching in a small college in Arizona. Like, you know, it was very interesting because two of my writers, one is, you know, married to someone who I think has money and lives in DC, and she was like, no way, I'm not doing this. And she's on her like 4th or 5th book. And then this other writer, again, struggling freelance journalist, she was like, you know, I can't even like pay the bills. Like you have to nominate me. And then, you know, she didn't get it anyway. So it's not like, you know, she took the money, and at the same time as I was doing this, because again, I was trying to think, you know, about all the implications here. Like one of the biggest PEN awards is the Jean Stein Award. And actually Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who signed the letter, won the first Jean Stein Award and gave a fantastic speech that I'll never forget. But I wrote to the people who managed that award and said, you should withdraw the award. Like that's the biggest money PEN gives away, is that award. And I wrote to the heirs of, you know, the estate of Jean Stein, and I said, you should pull it. And I think, you know, and I said to them, there's so many other options of organizations and institutions that did speak up for Palestine and Palestinian writers and journalists who would take your money. And they didn't write back. And they left the prize there, and someone's going to win it. But I just think that all this to say that I don't think it's up to me to decide whether a writer needs or doesn't need the money. So that's what I'm not sure this answered your question, but I feel like it has to be the writer's choice. Like, I can't decide for them that they should take a moral stand against something and not take the money.
The artist must eat thing. I think there's some. I think Lizzie Homisham wrote a really good critique of this. I think Marina Vishmit wrote about it at some point. I think what it effectively does, it's like the bad end of identity politics, where it kind of folds the political meaning of the work into the fact it exists at all, basically. And I think it's complicated. And I think that's maybe what's in the kernel of your question. So yeah, the good and bad versions of cancel culture, because obviously or good and bad woke, kind of, because we have learned a lot. We're in such a rapid learning process, and it's accumulative. That was pointed out a lot, that a lot of the people involved in the Palestine student movement had been politicized through the 2020 uprising and so on. To Ben's point, all these things have to happen collectively. But yeah, good woke is the increasing visibility of the colonial paradigm and its relationship to anti-blackness and other forms of white supremacy and so on. That's all great. And then and then the bad end is as a such and such person, I'm no longer accountable to anyone other than my own thriving, kind of, which is, I think is going to have to be and I think that's just, is another role of the discourse, kind of, which is not nothing. I think, the uselessness, it's not to say, anyway, whatever. I think the primacy of the discourse is becoming more and more evident, and the sort of idea that there's just some sort of base and the superstructure just floats around on top of it feels less and less true. So I think, these things have to be discursively addressed, and they do have to be delinked somehow. So it's yes, anti-blackness is an extremely important issue that has to be front and center of any political or organizing project, and at the same time that's not about the kind of reification of individual black people and their and so on. And that's obviously that reappears. Someone mentioned Palestinian artists who are in the art forum Palestine issue and so on. That just keeps reappearing, and I think we do get more and more sophisticated at addressing it. And I think there has been I've not been in New York so much, but it seems coming back that there has been a really amazing coalescence of all the lessons of the peak woke era that are now meeting with the paradigm of a national liberation struggle, and amazing shit could happen if they can both be kept in mind and be allowed to kind of cross-pollinate each other instead of being a sort of either or. It's we're over that one now and we're just moving on to this one instead.
We have one last question.
Well, thanks, Jasmine. I'm gonna think about what you'd said. Sorry, this is now feels opposite. I guess what I wanted to think about is if I reflect on the letter experience of my workplace, only junior black and brown staff signed, not because it only matters that other people sign, but this is a material reality about whatever risk or maybe even what are the alliances across struggle. And such a common line of reasoning why senior staff wouldn't join this effort is that they believe their work is within their politics is within their work. There's some special political power vested in their curating that the silent ones are actually doing the political work silently. So I guess I was inspired by Amani's comment about humility, although it's along a different lines of how to also be humble about what our practices are. So anyway, I really appreciate what Alessandra said about also recognizing one's influence within a structure. But I'll hold that with what Jasmine said maybe after.
Well, I also wanted to say that when I looked through all the signatories, I was very upset to see that the only publishing workers, meaning editors, I guess, in the industry that signed it were pretty young junior people. I didn't see anyone at my level or even like below my level. And I also hear you, you know, I think I'm hyper conscious that as an editor and a publisher that I'm not the one on the front lines. And it's not just because it's the authors who are on the front lines, but so are the booksellers and the librarians. And I have spoken to indie booksellers who are literally putting their physical safety on the line every day. They're getting beaten up for doing drag queen story hour. They're getting beaten up for having books. They're getting there's a 17-year-old trans worker at a bookstore in LA who got doxxed because they had on the display a book about Hamas. And this is a child, a teenager who got doxxed and whose life is ruined. And I think that when you're sitting where I'm sitting, you're hyper aware of all these things and how tiny you are. That said, you know, I think, again, maybe it's about a different way of talking about clarity. Like, you have to have that clarity and you have to talk to these people. I mean, I talk to librarians and indie booksellers as much as possible because, to my mind, in addition to the writers, those are the people who are on the front lines right now. And they're taking huge, huge risks, not just for, again, their physical safety, but also their livelihood. So there are a lot of people fighting out there. And I guess for me, I'm just proud I get to be a part of it in a small way.
How is it the opposite of what Jasmine said? I didn't understand the...
Well, what I understood was about that there's like over-focus on trying to get, like, let's say, certain senior figures to sign on when actually there's political power within, let's say, black and brown junior staff, let's say, because they were referencing early on in their career, something like that. So I guess I was just thinking through, I agree because that's the value of everyone being here. And in another way, I still am holding on to this kind of expectation or desire for people, you know, in a certain place in the structure to not use their place in the structure to justify why they shouldn't be visible in a certain way, because the way I understand it is that they somehow view their role within the structure as being more important than being part of a group.
Yeah, I mean, some people are really stupid, honestly. Like, I mean, I don't mean to, there's structural reasons, and I think, you know, a lot of people have written about how your position in a structure does affect your ability to conceive of it in certain ways. And one can overcome that, of course, with some uphill effort, but like, also a lot of these people are just like dumb and don't think very hard, and like they have a lot of self-justifications that they use throughout their life, you know, so I mean, I don't know. That's my personal like reaction to that, but there's more to say about it.
Some people are just stupid. With that, we are going to wrap it up just because we're out of time and we've kept people late here. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for coming. I hope that we'll keep talking together in groups afterwards. There's much more to do.